All right, so I'm here to welcome our next presenter. Our next speaker is a policy analyst at the Colorado Health Institute, whose work focuses on topics including climate change and health, geospatial analytics, and aging. She joined the Colorado Health Institute in May 2016 as a data visualization and storytelling intern. She's also connected to Boulder County through Boulder County Health, Public Health, and some work that she did around West Nile virus. Please join me in welcoming Chrissy Esposito.
It happens all the time. I can use the mic up there, right? Hello, everyone, and thanks, Lindsay. I actually have a nickname, Crispy, because when you say the name Chrissy Esposito, it sometimes comes out as Crispy. So I answer to both. But I am really excited to be here with you guys today. I guess Lindsay already did my introduction, but again, my name is Chrissy Esposito. I'm a policy analyst at the Colorado Health Institute, and there is my title slide, so we know what we're talking about today. We're going to be talking about two very important topics, and no, it's not West Nile virus in Boulder County. We're talking about aging and housing, and how these two topics are combining to create a crisis in Colorado. But first, I always like to take a poll and see who in the room is familiar with the Colorado Health Institute. Oh, wow. That is great. I'm glad we have so many, hopefully, supporters and fans out there. For those of you who are not familiar with us, we're an independent, nonpartisan health policy research organization, which is a mouthful, but it really means that we don't take sides or advocate for any policy and legislation that goes through the Capitol every year. But instead, we do a lot of needs assessments and data analyses and policy analyses to help inform regulations and for lawmakers and also organizations around the state. And we do a lot of work on topics all over Colorado. Literally, we touch all corners of Colorado, and we do aging, we do housing. Sometimes, like today, we combine them together. We do climate change, access to healthcare. I know someone came up to me saying they went to an access to healthcare presentation with one of my colleagues, Jeff Bontrager. So that's awesome, but we do a lot of work. But today, we're going to be talking about two things that are very near and dear to everyone's heart. We're here because we're very passionate about the subject of aging. But we couldn't be here today without a really huge thanks to the Next 50 Foundation. Who here is familiar with Next 50? All right, that's about what I figured. As we know, they're the only foundation in Colorado that's solely focused on adults that are age 50 and older and their caregivers. And so this year we decided to focus on housing because we saw it as an unmet need for older adults within our state. The second phase of our project, which we're starting right now with my colleague Leanna Major, is going to be focusing on the workforce, which we heard a lot from other presentations. So for those of you who have been to a CHI presentation before, you know that we like to have 3 key takeaways, meaning when you leave this presentation today, I just really hope you remember these 3 things. The first is going to be about affordability. We know that in Colorado, adults are living longer, but their annual income is being outpaced by the cost of housing. And in addition to issues with affordability, we know that access to adequate and accessible homes is becoming a struggle for those who are 65 and older. And last, we're going to be chatting about new data information that is available. We'll talk about this new toolkit we created for the Next 50 Initiative project and what we can do to help advocate for change for older Coloradans. But we'll start off with some good news. We are living longer in Colorado. Yay! In 2018, can anyone answer me with what is our average life expectancy in 2018? Okay, heard lots of different answers. The correct answer is 79. All right, what do we think about 100 years ago in 1918? Who thinks it was in the 60s? Okay, smart. Who thinks it was in the 50s? 40s? 30s? All right, that one gentleman right there, you are the winner. The answer is 39. But this was a trick question because in 1918 we had the big flu outbreak, so life expectancy was much lower than it had been in years prior. So in 1919, the average life expectancy was 55. So today we're living about 24 years longer, which is pretty incredible to think about. From 100 years, we're living a quarter century longer. Now, not the super great news. As we know in Colorado, it's becoming pretty hard to afford housing. Who can relate to that? Yes, that is not new news to anyone in this room. But as we're seeing with our older adult population who might have lower incomes compared to younger folks in their prime of earning, or they might have a fixed income, this is becoming increasingly more difficult. And so I have a lot of audience participation, if you can't tell. So I would just like to take the temperature of the room and see, do you know an older adult who has struggled with paying rent or their mortgage in Colorado? Okay. I like to say that's a fair amount of people. And so a lot more people are deciding to age in place, and this looks really different for a lot of people. You know, for some of us, we might think of something like this, where we can just stay in our home, and if we want to move to a more affordable area, we attach 2 million balloons and go to that place. But reality looks a little bit more like this. And reality is also something like this. I know in Haley Gleason's presentation, we saw this very similar graph, so I'm not going to go over it too in depth. But what we're seeing here is a trend in aging, and especially for our 65 to 79 age group and our 80 plus age group. So the dark blue is the 65 to 79, the light blue is the 80 plus. And now we're focusing here on those 2 red circles, which is looking at 2018 and 2030. Right now, we have about 800,000 adults that are 65 plus. In 2030, it'll be 1.2 million. So in 11 years, that's about a 50% increase. So that's something to consider because housing is unaffordable, which is what we just touched on. Colorado is actually one of the most unaffordable states in the country for housing. It's become extremely more expensive for everyone. And it's something to consider, are we creating a more insecure home environment for older adults if we're having a growing aging population and we have a housing environment that is just becoming unaffordable for every single person in this state? Well, not every single person, let's be honest. There's some people that can't afford it. There's also a few other things we need to consider. You know, housing is a challenge for a lot of people, which we just discussed. But it's especially a challenge for older adults because it just isn't a place where they live. It can also be a setting of care. They can get a lot of in-home services. So they need to be able to afford their housing as well as these health care services. It's imperative that these two can be affordable for an older adult. And then second, something that's on the forefront of probably every adult's mind is issues of affordability, accessibility, and support services. Those are the 3 pillars that I'm going to be focusing on today, and I will be going over a lot of data points, so at any point, I'll try to make it fun, but at any point, if you want to repeat a data point or statistic, please raise your hand and let me know. I'm happy to do that. And we're talking about these 3 because we're talking about these 3 as in accessibility, affordability, and support services because they're attached to our physical and mental health. So in another way to say it, housing is a foundation of health, or housing is health. So before we move on, I would like for you to just take for a moment and think of the people in your life who are impacted by aging, as well as housing in Colorado, to kind of keep this person in your mind to help make this topic more real. Up here on the screen, we can see Mama and Papa Esposito. These are my parents. They are ages 65 and 62, and they have some things that they have to start thinking about. My mom has vision issues. She's had multiple eye surgeries in the past few years, and her vision's becoming a big limitation in her life. And my dad, very high blood pressure, some knee issues and back issues. What does he need to be able to move around in his home as he's getting a little bit older? So I'd like for you to think of this person and then turn to the person next to you and just share who this person is and why this topic is so important with you. And I'm gonna give you about 20 to 30 seconds to do that. All right, I'll let you guys wrap up those conversations in about 10 to 15 more seconds. All right, everyone. It sounds like there was a lot of really good discussion out there. Great. So does everyone have that person in mind who we're thinking about for the rest of this presentation? I'm going to assume yes. I should have said raise our hands. So let's move on. Let's dive into affordability. So one of those three big pillars that we're talking about. And when we talk about affordability, like I said, a lot of older adults, they have lower incomes, or maybe they have a fixed income because they're on Social Security. And maybe if they are able to afford a new home, there's a dearth of affordable, accessible homes available. So this can leave a lot of older adults feeling stuck. So let's get into the meat of the data. So right now, let's talk about being house cost burdened. Who here knows the definition of house cost burdened? How much of your income are you spending towards rent if you're considered to be housing cost burdened? How many people think 10%? Okay. 20%. Where it actually is. 30%. All right, again, the people who raised their hand last were correct. So this is 30% of your income going towards your monthly rent or your mortgage. And by 2030, it's expected to see about 500,000 older adult Coloradans being housing cost burdened. So let's look at it a little bit different way. So we talked about income and how it's not increasing at the same amount as rent and housing prices. So an adult that is 65 and older, their income is increasing about 10%. Rent is increased by about 30%. And then the average affordable home, about 50%. And this changes as you age too. As we can see on this chart right here, those who are in the 50 to 64 age group, they're about 17% are housing cost burden. But as we get to the 65 plus and 80 plus category, we're seeing about 1 in 5 that are going to be housing cost burdened in Colorado. So let's break it down. What does it take? Let's just say I am a 66-year-old adult. My average income is about $2,100. So in reality, my rent or my monthly payments on my home should be about $650. Yeah, that deserves a little bit of a giggle, because reality is that median monthly rent in Colorado is about $1,000. That means for me, I'm about $350 in the red. That might be $350 I want to spend on food, healthcare costs, maybe adding something into my home to make it more accessible. Or maybe I want to travel, and heck, maybe I want to save it, because sometimes saving money is fun. So there is some differences between those who own a home and those who rent a home. As we can see, there are some protections for people who own a home. About 2 in 10 of homeowners that are 65 plus are housing cost burden compared to the 50% of those who are renting. But just because you own a home and you've paid off your mortgage doesn't mean you're 100% protected. There are these terrible things, well, they're great, but also terrible. Property taxes, those will increase over time. So let's just say they increase by $100 a month, but your income isn't increasing because maybe you're retired. That's gonna cause a problem down the road for someone. And then let's just dig into the income. So this might be intuitive that the less money that you bring in, the more likely you are to be housing cost burdened. And on this graph, we're looking at housing cost burdened and severe housing cost burdened. A lot of technical terms here, I'll break it down. Severe housing cost burden is when 50% of your income is going towards your monthly rent or your home payments. Or just housing cost burdened is 30%. And as we can see, those who are living below poverty, I'm sorry for people in the back if you can't see it. So the very top graph, those are the people that are living below 100%, so below the poverty line. About 70% are housing cost burdened, and over 50% are severe housing cost burdened. And we compare that down to those who are making 500% of the poverty level. So it's a huge difference. And we know that income isn't the only indicator of wealth. And what I mean is that there is a persistent racial issue when it comes to wealth in Colorado. There is a very long history in Colorado and US that housing policies have some racism in them. And so our Latinx and our Black neighbors have additional barriers and hurdles to affording a home and building equity over time. So we talked about differences in income, we talked about home ownership, we talked about how it varies by age. But what about where you live in Colorado? So a lot of times people think, okay, affordability, that's an urban issue. No, it's not. It's also a big issue here in a lot of rural areas. As we can see, the darker the green, the more housing cost burden older adults are in that county. So as we can see up in Jackson and Grand County, all the way down to like Teller, these are regions that are severely, or not severely, they're housing cost burdened. And so even areas that are in that lighter green, you're like, okay, well, they're doing a little better. It's hard to get new affordable developments going in rural areas. They tend not to have the financial means to get those developments going. So let's talk about another population. So I think every speaker before me has talked about the direct care workers. So who are the people that are providing these services? Where are they going to live? As we know, direct care workers, people providing these services for older adults, they don't make that much money. That's no secret probably to anyone in this room. If they're making barely above the median, or they're barely making between $20,000 and $30,000 a year, how can they afford to live near the population that they are supporting? That's gonna affect recruitment and retention of them. Maybe that's gonna leave a huge gap in the people who need these services. So just something to keep noodling over as we're talking about affordability. Yes, it's for older adults, but it's also for the people providing care for them. And so our last little tidbit on affordability, we're gonna talk about, if we're spending a lot of money towards putting our home, what is that taking away from? So if you're low income and cost burdened, that's taking about 53% away that you'd put towards food. And that's about 70% that it's taking away from medical care costs. And as we get older, we're gonna have more healthcare costs. So the fact that we're gonna be less able to afford food or medical care costs, that's just unacceptable. But moving on, let's just say I waved a magic wand and we fixed affordability for housing in Colorado. Yay! We still have this issue of accessibility. We need to have accessible homes because about 9 in 10 older adults, they want to age in place. They want to age in their home. So their home needs to be accessible, it needs to be safe and functional, and they also need to have an accessible community. So there are kind of two parts to accessibility. And we know that as we age, we're going to need a little bit more support in terms of what we need in our house and who we need to come in and help take care of us. Because currently 1 in 3 older adults have a disability today. And at some point in their lifetime, 2 in 3. So the odds are a majority of us are gonna have a disability at some point in our lifetime. And that can be something like a vision limitation, just like my mother has. And as we said, accessibility comes in 2 forms. A lot of times we really just think of what's accessible inside our home. But there's also a really important aspect of, is your community accessible to you? Is there public transportation? Can you walk in your community? Can you get to the grocery store? Can you get to the doctor's office? These are all things we need to be thinking about. Do you have community connections? No one wants to be socially isolated when they're getting older. But let's talk about homes. So there's a big problem with accessibility in homes. About 1 in 3 homes have a 0-step entry. And then when we think about those that are wheelchair accessible, 1%. And a lot of this is because single-family homes and structures that are 4 units or less don't have federal requirements to make these homes accessible. So we're running into an issue where there's fewer accessible homes in Colorado. And then let's talk about the community. We're kind of going all over the place here with accessibility. So the ease of getting around in their community. In 2010, 72% said it was very easy for them to get around their community. That's gone down to 66%. So it's slowly decreasing. And this is a bigger problem in the rural areas compared to urban areas. As we can see, about half of older adults living in rural areas say they're about 15 minutes away from a hospital. Compare that to the 87% of those living in rural or urban areas. And having an accessible community is important for everyone, and it's not just older adults. If we're able to walk to where we want to go, it's good for our overall health, but for older adults, it helps reduce cognitive decline. It can also lower rates of obesity, both very important in preventative care. So we talked about affordability, we talked about accessibility. What about in-home supports? Who is going to be taking care of people that want to age in place? And there is a whole spectrum of these, and I'm not going to spend too much time going over them because I could probably spend an hour going over each one of these. But I'm going to limit to it about 90 seconds. And I'm going to have Leanna, my coworker, time me on these. So, because we need to talk about how are we going to support our older adults as they age. And it might look something like indirect supports. It might be something like a transportation service to help take someone to the grocery store, might help take them to their doctor's appointment. So this is with people with less intensive needs that still want to live their everyday quality of life. But let's flip to the opposite end of the spectrum. So let's look at permanent supportive housing. Now this is where you have housing and then all the comprehensive services that you might need. And when you go into one of these buildings, you're not just going to find older adults. You're also going to find people who are struggling with substance use disorder, those who are homeless. And then we don't have a slide on the homeless population, but this is a very important population to consider when we think about housing, because the homeless population, they tend to age faster than those who have adequate access to homes. So what might be a 70-year-old struggling with certain physical and mental health issues, that's happening more when someone's 40 or 50 and when they're homeless. So we need to start thinking about those populations when we're considering housing and aging, and how certain populations age differently depending on their traumatic or environmental experiences. So somewhere in the middle, we're going to talk about service coordination. So this is where there's already a housing unit, and then it's really close to a hospital or a social care network. So a part-time nurse or social worker will come provide services to adults that are already living in these apartment buildings. And this is an example of what's being built actually in Durango. And I'm going over it in our solutions slide in like 6 slides from now, so I'm not going to go too in depth. But these are just a couple examples of like the types of supports and services that older adults are going to need. So let's quickly summarize the impact. And sorry if I keep zipping in and out. I'm a mover, and being stuck at a podium is really hard for me right now. So let's talk about things that are visible. These are the impacts of housing in Colorado on older adults. Things that we see, we might see someone struggling with rent, utilities, property taxes, repairs, insurance. But then there's also things that are invisible. Are we seeing the displacement and doubling up? Physical and mental health impacts? What about food access, the workforce, so the people that are providing these in-home services? What about transportation? And lastly, what about access to medical care appointments? And so diving into our last slide, you guys have been a very great audience, so thank you. And it's not our last slide, I mean our last key takeaway. That was misleading, I'm sorry. It's not over yet. So we're going to talk about some new data information that is available to everyone. And so with the Next 50 initiative, we created a housing toolkit. Now, what that means is that we created this Tableau dashboard that you can access online, and you can put in your county, and it tells you everything about older adults related to affordability, accessibility, and health and well-being in your community. And we have the link at the bottom, and I'm happy to share it afterwards. But this is a really good way to be able to take this information and bring it to organizations or bring it to city council members, be like, hey, in my community, X amount of people are having trouble accessing affordable homes. And we can just do a quick spotlight on Boulder, since this is where we are today. And just looking at a few different highlights, I know it's really hard to see, but we see that in Boulder, about 27% of older adults are housing cost burdened, and about 9%, this is kind of big, only 9% say they have access to affordable and accessible housing in this region. And so, like I said, we really encourage you to share this information. Everyone in every single county in Colorado has a sheet like this for all 3 of those topics, and they're easily to print out too. Just download it as an image if you don't want to look at it online. Sometimes my eyes need a break too. I don't want to stare at a screen forever. And that kind of leads us to our next point. We have some of this information, but where do we go from here? And I'm going to breeze through this because we do have a solutions panel in like 2 hours. I'm looking at Lindsay. It's like a solutions panel, am I right? Cool, yeah. So they're going to talk a lot about different solutions that are coming with housing and aging. And I have my wonderful colleague, Leanna Major. She's actually the creator of this entire content. She wrote a report on everything I just presented on, and she has a lot of information about different housing solutions related to aging in Colorado. Yeah, I'm talking you up. So some things that she could be talking about is this Durango housing structure that we talked about. It's senior residence at 3 Springs. What makes this so special? Why is it a solution? It's using multiple funding sources to create it. We know that a lot of people don't, not a lot of people, a lot of financiers and investors, they don't want to create affordable housing. It's a big risk for them. So maybe we get some federal tax credits. Maybe we get some philanthropic grants, in-kind donations. And that's what this development did. And they're opening in 2020 with 53 units for older adults. And then I think a lot of us here heard about the SASH program in Vermont. I'm not going to go into it too much, but it's a community-based program that helps with service coordination in over like 140 communities in Vermont. These are just two examples. Again, I'm going to let my coworker Leanna go in depth a little bit more later. And then I'm going to briefly just say we are doing our next phase of the project of the Next 50 initiative because we want to talk about who's taking care of our older adults. We talked about how our family, friends, and our neighbors, informal caregivers, but we're really focusing on direct care providers, the people that are going to be coming into our homes and taking care of this growing population of older adults that want to age in place. And we're going to be talking about recruitment and retention, both very important things, because this is one of the biggest or like largest growing professions in the country. So how are we going to support this workforce? And then lastly, just going over our 3 key takeaways. So remember that affordability is a big issue for older adults in Colorado, and that although we are living longer, our incomes are not matching the housing costs. And that it's extremely hard to find accessible and adequate housing in Colorado, especially if your age is 65 and older. And then lastly, we just talked about some of the new data sources that we have related to the data toolkit, and then a little bit later we'll be talking about different housing solutions that are available for older Coloradans. And again, thank you to the Next 50 initiative. I wouldn't be here without their support and their funding to talk about this really important topic. And then thank you all for letting me talk to you for the last like 40 minutes. Oh, sure. Oh, we can definitely do some Q&A, and if I might also tap my colleague Leanna for any questions as well. I'll also be around the rest of the day if you want to chat over a seltzer water at happy hour. Oh, yeah.
I was just curious what your data sources are.
Oh, yeah. So we got a lot of information from the American Community Survey, and then we have a lot of data from CASOA. Leanna, I don't know if you want to jump in. So Leanna, I said, she was the brainchild behind this entire project, and she knows every single data source. So I don't know if we can give her a mic so she can just whip off those data sources.
I'd be happy to share with you exactly all of them. We did use the American Housing Survey as well for some of the accessibility numbers for Colorado statewide data. But there are some, there isn't a ton of accessibility data available in our state. That's a huge gap that I would love if there was more of. But encourage you to go to that website and take a look at our toolkit. And if you have any further questions, we can grab any data that you might need more specifically.